Abby Weston had no money, no protection, and three hungry children depending on her when the orphanage doors closed forever. Desperate, she climbed toward Vance's Hollow, where a scarred mountain man was said to shoot trespassers on sight. But what she found there would uncover a hidden deed, a murdered family, and a reverend's terrible secret. This story reminds us that family is not only blood, it is who stands with you when the world turns cruel. If it moves you, please like, comment, share, and subscribe.
The Texas sun in August of 1878 didn't just shine, it punished. It beat down on the limestone hills of the hill country until the earth cracked wide open, begging for a drop of rain that just wasn't coming. This was the Reconstruction era, a hard time, a time when men with fat pockets swallowed up the land, and folks with empty bellies just tried to hold on to the dust. Inside the St. Agnes orphanage, the heat was already rising. Abigail Weston Abby to the kids woke before the sun. She was 18. She looked younger, but her hands told the truth. Her palms were thick with calluses, hardened by years of scrubbing, mending, and keeping three little souls tethered to the earth. She walked into the kitchen and stirred a pot on the rusted iron stove. Breakfast, if you could even call it that. Just warm water. A meager handful of stale breadcrumbs floating on top. The kids dragged themselves to the wobbly wooden table. Charlie, 7 years old and always angry, scowled at his tin cup. Will, 9, just stared down into his water, his eyes older than any boy's ought to be. Little Sadie, barely 5, didn't look at the table at all. She was sitting on the floor, using a piece of charcoal to draw a bird on a scrap of paper. She hadn't spoken a single word since a railroad accident took her folks. Abby looked down at her own tin cup. She listened to the hollow rumble of Charlie's stomach. Quiet as a shadow, she picked up her cup. She tipped half of her meal into Charlie's bowl. She poured the rest into Sadie's. She set her empty cup back down on the rough wood and offered a small, tight smile. She didn't say she was full. She didn't make a fuss. She just folded her hands in her lap. Some love you don't talk about. You just serve it up, even when it leaves you empty. By noon, Abby walked the 2 dusty miles into the town of Redemption. She went straight to the mercantile. She asked Mr. Harmon for a sack of flour on credit. Just one. The old man wouldn't meet her eyes. He shook his head. Can't do it, Abby. My books are bleeding as it is. She didn't beg. Dignity was free, and she intended to keep hers. She nodded, thanked him for his time, and walked back out into the blinding glare of the street. That when she saw him. Reverend Ezekiel Thorne. He wore a black suit that somehow never caught the dust. He smiled, a wide, perfectly practiced thing. As she approached, he reached into his coat and handed her a folded piece of heavy paper. The town council has made a decision. Abigail, the Reverend said. His voice was smooth, like warm honey poured over gravel. We are closing the orphanage. The land is being repurposed. The children will be relocated to state facilities. It is just a formality, my child. Abby felt her chest tighten. State facilities meant separation. It meant Sadie and Charlie and Will would never see each other again. It is God's will, Ezekiel continued, resting a heavy hand on his Bible. Poverty is a test of faith. Abigail, the Lord purifies us through our suffering. Abby looked at the eviction notice. Then she looked up, right into the Reverend's pale eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't look down. With respect, Reverend, Abby said, her voice ringing clear and steady in the quiet street. Poverty is a circumstance. It is not a punishment. And it certainly isn't a test. These children deserve a chance to live. They do not need to be purified by starving. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving the powerful man standing in silence. But bravery during the day doesn't fill a belly at night. When the sun finally dropped, the heat stayed. It sat heavy and thick in the dark rooms of the orphanage. Abby stood alone in the kitchen. She opened the pantry door, empty. Not a grain of rice, not a pinch of salt. Just bare, warped wood. From the bedroom, a sound broke the silence. A whimper. Then a sob. It was Charlie. He was curled up on his thin blanket, clutching his stomach in the dark. Will was sitting awake in the corner, his jaw locked tight. Sadie reached out in the shadows and gripped the hem of Abby's skirt. Abby looked out the broken window. She looked toward the west, toward the jagged, black silhouettes of the limestone hills. Folks in Redemption talked about those hills, whispered. Really, they said a monster lived up there, a giant of a man. A savage named Silas Vance. They called him the Mountain. They said he was dangerous. They said he chased away anyone who dared step foot in his hollow. But starvation wasn't just dangerous. It was a promise. Abby took a slow, deep breath. She looked down at the 3 children. Her family. "Pack your things," Abby whispered into the dark. "Get your shoes on." Will frowned, his voice a dry rasp. "Where are we going, Abby?" She looked back at the jagged peaks cutting into the starry Texas sky. To the mountain. They left before the sun even thought about rising. No one in Redemption saw them go. The town was asleep, wrapped in a blanket of dry heat and quiet indifference. Abby led the way. She held Sadie's small hand. Will walked right behind them, keeping a close eye on Charlie. They didn't have a wagon. They didn't have a mule. Just the clothes on their backs and a tin canteen holding 3 cups of lukewarm water. The flat dirt of the trail gave way to the broken earth of the Texas hill country. It was a hard place. Beautiful if you didn't have to survive it, but unforgiving. The ground here wasn't soil, it was limestone rock baked white by the sun, cracked and sharp. Scrub oak and twisted mesquite trees clung to the dust like they were holding on for dear life. Patches of prickly pear cactus spread out like green landmines. By mid-morning, the sun was a hammer beating down on their shoulders. Charlie started dragging his feet. He was 7. Anger was usually his fuel. He'd kick rocks. He'd complain about the dust. But around 10 o'clock, he stopped complaining. He just went quiet. That worried Abby more than anything. She stopped under the thin shade of a cedar tree. She uncorked the canteen. She poured a shallow sip into the tin cup and handed it to Charlie. He swallowed it in a gulp. She gave the same to Sadie. The little girl drank, her big green eyes staring blankly into the brush. She hadn't made a sound all morning. Will shook his head when Abby offered him the cup. "I ain't thirsty," the 9-year-old lied. His lips were cracked. White dust coated his eyelashes. Abby looked at him. She didn't call out his lie. She just saw it for what it was. A boy trying to be a man because the men in his life had disappeared. She poured a sip anyway and held it to his chest until he took it. She didn't drink any herself. She corked the canteen. They kept walking. The incline grew steeper. The rocks grew sharper. Abby's thin leather shoes offered no protection. She could feel every jagged edge biting into her soles, but she didn't look down. She looked up at the looming peaks, Vance Hollow, that S where the rumors pointed. By early afternoon, the wind changed. It didn't bring relief. It brought a dust storm. A squall of red dirt and stinging sand sweeping through the valley. It hit them like a physical blow. Abby pulled her shawl over Sadie's face. "Keep your heads down," she shouted over the howling wind. "Keep moving. Just a little further." It was a lie. She didn't know how much further. She didn't even know if there was a real destination. Just a desperate hope to find something other than a locked orphanage door. Will scooped Sadie up. The 9-year-old hoisted his 5-year-old sister onto his back. He gritted his teeth and leaned into the wind. He didn't ask for help. He just took the weight. There was a lesson in that, a silent truth about duty. Real strength isn't about how much you can lift in a fight. It's about what you were willing to carry when nobody is looking. Then it happened. Charlie stumbled. His boot caught the lip of a jagged limestone shelf. He pitched forward, falling hard onto the unforgiving rock. The sound of his knee hitting the stone was a sickening thud. Abby dropped to her knees beside him. She reached for him, but Charlie pushed her hands away. He scrambled backward in the dirt. Blood was already blooming through the torn fabric of his trousers. Bright and red against the pale dust, the wind howled, and finally the boy broke. The anger drained out of him, the tough exterior shattered. He wasn't a rebel, he was just a 7-year-old boy, alone, terrified, and starving. He threw his head back and cried. It wasn't a whimper. It was a raw, primal scream that tore from the bottom of his empty stomach. "Abby, I'm so hungry," he sobbed, the wind catching his words and throwing them against the canyon walls. "I can't walk anymore, my leg hurts. We have no food, we have no food." The words echoed in the canyon, "We have no food." Abby reached for him again. She pulled his rigid, shaking body to her chest. She wrapped her arms around him, burying his face in her shoulder. She rocked him. She had no bread to give him, no medicine for his knee. She only had herself. She placed her body between him and the howling wind. Then, the wind seemed to stop, or at least the sun disappeared. Abby looked up. A shadow had fallen over them, a shadow entirely too large to belong to a normal man. He stood on the ridge directly above them. Silas Vance, the mountain. He was a giant, 6 foot 5 inches of solid corded muscle and bone. He wore a heavy leather coat that looked like it had been carved from the earth itself. A wide-brimmed hat cast a deep shadow over his face. A Winchester rifle rested casually over his massive shoulder. But what caught Abby's eye wasn't the gun. It was his neck. A thick ropey burn scar crawled up from his collar, twisting its way to his jawline. The flesh was pale and angry, a memory of fire. The rumors in town said he was a savage. They said he shoots a trespasser as soon as look at him. Silas stared down at them. His eyes were dark, unreadable. Abby didn't scream, she didn't cower, she stood up. She let go of Charlie and stepped deliberately in front of the three children. She squared her small shoulders. She had no weapon. She barely weighed 100 pounds wet, but she tilted her chin up and met the giant's gaze. She was ready to die to buy the kids time to run. Silas Vance looked at her. He looked at the fierce defensive set of her jaw. Then his eyes shifted to Will, who had dropped Sadie and stood with his fists balled up. Finally, the giant looked down at Charlie, who was bleeding in the dirt. Wiping snot and tears from his face, Silas shifted his rifle. Abby braced herself. But Silas didn't aim the gun. He slung it across his back by its leather strap. Then, he stepped down off the ridge. His boots crunched heavy on the limestone. He moved with a terrifying grace, swift, silent. He stopped right in front of Abby, up close. He was a wall of a man. She had to crane her neck to look him in the eye. He didn't say a word to her. He didn't demand to know why they were on his land. Instead, he bypassed her entirely. He knelt in the dirt beside Charlie. Up close, Silas' hands were massive, thick-fingered and heavily calloused. Hands that could snap a man's neck without much effort. He reached out. Charlie flinched, throwing his arms up to protect his face. But the giant didn't strike. His huge, scarred hand moved with absolute gentleness. He slipped one arm under Charlie's knees and the other behind the boy's back, without a grunt, without a breath of effort. Silas lifted the 7-year-old boy into the air. He cradled him against his broad chest like he weighed no more than a bundle of dry kindling. Charlie froze. He looked up at the scarred face of the giant, his tears stopping instantly out of sheer shock. Silas didn't stop there. He turned to where Sadie stood shivering in the wind. He extended his massive left arm and scooped the 5-year-old girl up. Resting her securely on his thick forearm, he held two children, effortlessly. He looked at Will. He gave the boy a single firm nod, a silent acknowledgement of the boy's effort, a passing of the baton. You carried them far enough. I've got them now. Finally, Silas looked at Abby. His dark eyes locked onto hers. He still didn't speak. He just turned his broad back to the wind and began walking up the hidden trail toward the high cliffs. He didn't tell her to follow. He didn't have to. Abby looked at Will. Will looked at Abby. They fell into step behind the giant, walking in his massive wake, where the wind couldn't hit them quite so hard. The trail didn't make sense. From the bottom of the valley it looked like a dead end, just a solid wall of white limestone reaching up to the sky. But Silas didn't stop. He walked straight toward the rock. Abby hurried behind him, her breath coming short. As they got closer, the illusion broke. A narrow fissure, barely wide enough for a horse, cut through the stone at an angle. Silas stepped into the shadow of the cleft. Abby and Will followed. The air cooled instantly. The howling wind died down to a whisper. They walked through the natural stone corridor for 50 yards. Then the rock walls opened up. Abby stopped dead in her tracks. The town of Redemption said Silas Vance lived in a cave like a wild animal. They said his family farm had burned to the ground 5 years ago, leaving nothing but ash and ghosts. The town was wrong. Spread out before them was Vance's Hollow. It wasn't a ruin. It was a fortress, and it was beautiful. A sprawling 2-story mansion made of hand-hewn limestone blocks sat nestled in the heart of the canyon. The roof was tight and well shingled. A deep porch wrapped around the front. Off to the side, a sturdy wooden stable housed 2 healthy-looking horses. Beyond that, a thriving vegetable garden greened the dusty earth, fed by a natural spring that pooled into a stone basin. On the wide front porch, protected from the rain by a deep overhang, sat a long wooden bookshelf. It was packed tight with leather-bound books. This wasn't the lair of a savage. This was the work of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Silas walked up the steps to the porch. The front door swung open before he even reached it. A woman stood in the doorway. She was a black woman, somewhere in her late 40s, wearing a crisp, flour-dusted apron over a simple blue dress. Her hair was tied back in a neat kerchief. She took one look at Silas carrying the 2 dirt-covered, bleeding children. Then she looked past his shoulder at Abby and Will. She didn't ask questions. She didn't panic. "Lord have mercy," she muttered, stepping aside. "Bring them into the kitchen, Silas. Put them by the stove." Silas stepped inside. The house smelled like cedar wood, saddle leather, and something else. Something miraculous, beef stew. Abby felt her knees go weak at the smell of it. The rich aroma of roasted meat, carrots, and wild onions simmering in a cast-iron pot. It hit her empty stomach like a physical blow. Silas set Charlie down gently on a wooden chair. He placed Sadie on the chair next to him. The woman in the apron immediately went to work. She grabbed a clean rag, dipped it in a basin of warm water, and knelt by Charlie's bloody knee. "I'm Hattie," she said, her voice rich and steady. "Hattie Jenkins. You just sit still, little man. This is gonna sting a bit, but it'll keep the rot out." She cleaned Charlie's wound with a practiced hand. Charlie winced, but he didn't cry. He was too distracted by the large iron pot bubbling on the stove. Hattie saw where his eyes were fixed. She smiled, a warm, deep thing. She stood up, took 4 wooden bowls from a shelf, and ladled them full to the brim with thick brown stew. She set a basket of warm cornbread in the center of the table. "Eat," she said. Charlie didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed a wooden spoon and started shoveling the stew into his mouth so fast he choked. Will sat down next to him, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up his spoon. He ate slower, but with an intensity that broke Abby's heart. Sadie just stared at her bowl. The steam curled up, warming her dirty face. She looked up at Hattie, her big eyes wide and questioning, like she was waiting to be told it was a trick, like she was waiting for someone to snatch the bowl away. Hattie leaned over the table. She rested her hands on the wood and looked right at the little girl. "You eat, child," Hattie said, her voice dropping into a serious, undeniable cadence. "Don't you ever look at food like you gotta apologize for wanting it. A full belly is a human right. It ain't a privilege granted by folks in fine clothes. The good Lord put food in the dirt for everybody. You eat, and you eat until you refull." That was a truth Abby had known in her bones, but hearing it spoken out loud in this stone house made it real. Sadie picked up her spoon. She took a bite, then another. Abby stood near the door. She hadn't sat down. Hattie pushed a bowl toward the empty chair. "Sit down, girl. You're shaking like a leaf." "Where is Mr. Vance?" Abby asked. "He's outside," Hattie said. "Silas don't do well with crowds. 4 new faces in his kitchen is about 3 too many for him right now. Sit, eat." Abby sat. She ate the stew. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. It tasted like survival. When the bowls were empty and the children were finally miraculously full, Charlie laid his head down on the wooden table and fell asleep right there. Will sat beside him, his eyelids drooping. Hattie carried Sadie to a settee in the corner and covered her with a quilt. Abby wiped her mouth. The panic of the morning had faded, replaced by a cold, hard reality. They couldn't stay here for free. She walked out the back door of the kitchen. Silas was standing in the yard. He had his heavy coat off. He was splitting firewood. He didn't use a chopping block. He stood a log on end in the dirt, swung an axe in a wide, vicious arc, and split the wood clean down the middle with a single strike. He moved with a rhythm. Chop, breathe, chop, breathe. Abby walked up to the edge of the woodpile. She waited until he buried the axe head into a stump and paused. He looked at her. The burn scar on his neck looked redder in the late afternoon sun. "Mr. Vance," Abby said. Her voice was steady. "I need to thank you for my children." Silas picked up a piece of split wood and tossed it onto a massive pile. "They ain't your children. You're too young. They're mine to look after," Abby corrected him. "And I owe you for the food. And the medicine." Silas didn't look at her. "You don't owe me anything." "I do," Abby insisted, stepping closer. "But I need you to know something. I don't take charity. I won't be a beggar in your house. I can cook, I can scrub floors, I can mend clothes, and I can pull weeds. The boys can work the stable. We will earn our keep until we can find a place to go." Silas stopped moving. He stood up straight. He looked down at this tiny, fierce girl in a dusty dress. He saw the pride in her spine. He recognized it. It was the same pride that had kept him hauling stones for 5 years when the whole town thought he was dead. He pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped the sweat from his hands. "I don't do charity, Miss Weston," Silas said. His voice was a deep rumble, like thunder miles off in the distance. Abby blinked. "How do you know my name?" "I know everyone in Redemption, even if they don't know me," Silas said. He stepped closer. "Listen to me. Charity is what the church gives you to make themselves feel better. It puts one person on their knees and the other on a pedestal." He pointed a thick finger at the stone house. "I built this place. Me and Hattie keep it running. There's always work. You have labor. I have chores. We trade. That makes us equals." He looked her dead in the eye, delivering the lesson like it was gospel. "Respect starts when neither of us has to bow to the other. You do the work, you eat the food. That's the deal." Abby felt a knot in her chest untangle. He wasn't taking pity on her. He was giving her a job. He was giving her back her dignity. That's the deal. Silas nodded once. He picked up his axe. The conversation was over. That evening, the hollow grew quiet. The crickets started their sawing in the high grass. Inside the house, a fire crackled in the stone hearth. Abby sat in a rocking chair, mending a tear in Charlie S. shirt. Hattie was humming softly as she washed the iron pot. Sadie was sitting on a rug near the fire. Earlier, Silas had walked into the room. placed a fresh piece of heavy paper and a stick of charcoal on the floor next to the little girl, and walked back out without a word. Sadie was drawing. Abby watched her from the chair. Sadie's small hand moved with surprising purpose. She wasn't drawing a bird this time. She was pressing hard, shading in thick, dark lines. Silas stepped into the room from the hallway. He stopped near the fireplace, looking down. Abby leaned forward to see what Sadie had drawn. It was a flower, but not a pretty one. It was a circle, surrounded by sharp, jagged thorns, a perfect, symmetrical crest, a thorn flower. Abby didn't think much of it, a child's imagination. But she happened to look up at Silas. The giant was staring at the piece of paper. The color had completely drained from his face. The muscles in his jaw were locked tight, twitching under the skin. His massive hands slowly curled into fists at his sides. For a split second, the calm, gentle giant who had carried 2 children up a mountain was gone. In his place stood a man looking at a ghost. Silas didn't say a word. He turned on his heel and walked out the front door, disappearing into the dark Texas night. Abby looked back down at the drawing of the thornflower. Something told her the past had just caught up to the present. The rhythm of Vance Hollow was built on hard work. It was a good rhythm, the kind that kept your mind off the past and your hands busy in the present. But Charlie was 7, and Charlie was angry. The food had filled his belly, but it hadn't chased the ghosts out of his head. He was a boy used to fighting for scraps, used to expecting a backhand if he stepped out of line. Peace made him restless. It made him itch. It happened on their 3rd morning. Charlie was supposed to be fetching water from the spring. He was swinging the heavy oak bucket. Testing his limits, he swung it too high. The iron handle slipped from his small fingers. The bucket hit the jagged limestone border of the well. Crack! The oak splintered. The iron band snapped. The bucket fell to the dirt, ruined. Charlie froze. The blood drained from his face. Back at the orphanage, breaking a tool meant no supper. It meant the switch. He stared at the broken wood. His breathing turned shallow. Quick! Panicked, a heavy shadow fell over him. Silas stood there. He had walked up without a sound. The giant looked down at the shattered bucket. Then he looked at the boy. Charlie threw his arms up over his head, bracing for the blow. He squeezed his eyes shut. The blow never came. Instead, Silas knelt in the dirt. He picked up the broken pieces of oak. He turned them over in his massive hands. "Oak is tough," Silas said. His voice was a low rumble, but it splits if it hits wrong, just like anything else. Charlie slowly lowered his arms. He looked at the giant. "I broke it. I didn't mean to, I know." Silas stood up. "Go to the shed. Bring me the wood glue. Bring the iron clamps and the sandpaper." Charlie ran. He came back with the tools, his chest heaving. Silas sat on a stump. He patted the empty space beside him. Charlie sat for the next hour. Silas didn't say a word about being careless. He didn't raise his voice. He just handed Charlie the sandpaper. He showed the boy how to smooth the splintered edges. He let Charlie apply the glue. He let him turn the screw on the iron clamp. Silas guided the boy's hands. Steady, patient. Charlie's breathing slowed down. The panic faded. The anger drained out into the wood. Silas wiped his hands on a rag. He looked at the boy. "You got a lot of anger in you, Charlie. Anger is fire. Let it burn wild. It'll burn your own house down. Put it in your hands, put it to a tool, and you can build something that lasts." Charlie looked at the mended bucket. He nodded. He understood. No switch, no shouting, just the quiet mending of broken things. That was how you healed a boy used to being bruised. Inside the house, Abby was doing her part of the trade. She was cleaning the back storeroom. It was a dusty room, filled with canvas sacks, spare harnesses and old tools. She wiped down a high wooden shelf. Her rag caught on something, a small, heavy tin box tucked all the way in the back. Abby pulled it down. The latch was loose. The lid popped open. Inside there wasn't money. There were papers, a few dried wildflowers, and a daguerreotype, an old photograph printed on copper. Abby wiped the dust off the glass. It was a family, a man and a woman, standing proud. And a boy. The boy was maybe 10 years old. He was tall for his age. His eyes were dark, serious, and clear. There was no scar on his neck. "That was taken in Galveston," a voice said. Abby jumped. Hattie was standing in the doorway. She held a basket of folded laundry. "I'm sorry," Abby said quickly, closing the box. "I wasn't snooping. I was just cleaning the shelf." Hattie stepped into the room. She didn't look mad. She just looked tired. "I know, child. It's all right. Ain't no shame in looking at history." Hattie set the basket down. She pointed to the box. "That's all that's left of the Vance family. Silas' mama, his daddy, and his little sister, though she ain't in that picture. She came along later." Abby traced the edge of the tin box. "What happened to them?" "Fire," Hattie said. The word hung in the dusty air. Heavy. Cold, 5 years ago, deep in the night, the whole house went up like a dry pine cone. Silas was out in the barn, tending a sick foal. He saw the flames. He ran in. Hattie crossed her arms. She looked out the small window, toward the limestone cliffs. He pulled his sister out. But she took in too much smoke. Her lungs were burnt. She died 2 days later. The parents, they never made it out of the bedroom. Silas got that scar on his neck from a falling beam trying to reach them. Abby felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She thought of Sadie, of Will and Charlie, the absolute terror of losing the only people who tethered you to the earth. So he brought the ruins of his family here, Abby asked, to this house. Hattie turned her head. She looked at Abby with a fierce, burning pride. Child, you don't understand, Hattie said. There was no house. Abby frowned. What do you mean? The fire took the old homestead. Burned it to white ash, Hattie said. When Silas woke up from the fever, when his burns finally scarred over, he didn't have a roof. He didn't have a dime. The town of Redemption thought he was dead, or crazy. Hattie stepped closer. She tapped her finger on the thick limestone wall of the storeroom. He built this, Hattie said. Her voice was thick with emotion. Every single block, every piece of timber. He went to the quarry. He cut the stone. He dragged it here with a borrowed mule. He mixed the mortar. He laid the foundation. Abby stared at the walls, the massive, perfect walls. 5 years, Hattie whispered. 5 years of hauling rock in the dead heat of summer. 5 years of swinging a hammer until his hands bled. Alone, in the quiet, the town thinks a savage lives up here. They don't know he built a monument to outlast his own grief. Abby couldn't breathe. The sheer will of it, the impossible staggering strength required to carry that much stone, to carry that much sorrow. Silas wasn't hiding. He was making a stand. He was refusing to be erased. That night, Abby walked out to the woodpile. The air was cool. The stars were scattered across the black Texas sky like thrown diamonds. Silas was sitting on a chopping block. He wasn't doing anything, just looking out into the dark. Abby stopped a few feet away. She didn't want to startle him, Hattie told me, Abby said quietly. Silas didn't turn around. His broad shoulders barely moved as he breathed. Hattie talks too much. She didn't tell it like gossip. She told it like scripture, Abby said. She took a step closer. I lost my folks to yellow fever. I was 6. I don't remember much, just the coughing and the silence after. Silas turned his head. The moonlight caught the rough edge of his scar. Silence is the worst part. Yes, Abby agreed. It gets so loud. She sat down on a log across from him. She smoothed her skirt over her knees. Why didn't you go somewhere else? Abby asked. Start over. Silas looked down at his massive hands. A man runs from his ghosts. He just brings them to a new town. I stayed where they fell. I built the walls thick. Thought maybe the wind wouldn't sound like them anymore. Abby looked at the giant, the monster of the mountain. He was just a boy who lost his mother, trapped in the body of a titan. She didn't offer pity. Pity was a weak thing. She offered truth. You didn't build it to keep the wind out, Silas, Abby said. You built it because you didn't know how to stop loving them. Every stone you carried was just a way of holding on. Silas raised his eyes. He looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time in 5 years, someone had looked past the scar, past the size, and seen the man underneath. They sat in the dark, together. And for a little while, the silence wasn't loud at all. It was just quiet, 20 miles away in the town of Redemption. Reverend Ezekiel Thorne sat in his leather chair. His office smelled of expensive tobacco and old books. The oil lamp flickered on his mahogany desk. A man stood in the shadows near the door, rough-looking, smelling of cheap whiskey and horse sweat. The orphanage is empty, the rough man said. The girl and the 3 brats, gone. Thorne steepled his fingers. The gold ring on his right hand caught the light. Did they take the stagecoach? No ticket bought? Nobody saw them leave. But an old drunk said he saw them walking west, toward the limestone ridge, toward the hollow. Thorne's eyes narrowed. His jaw tightened. Find 'em, Thorne said. His voice was smooth honey hiding a razor blade. That land must be cleared. Goddess work requires a clean slate. Find the orphans, and if the scarred freak gets in your way, burn him out again. Time didn't stop in the hollow. It settled. 2 weeks passed. The red dirt of Texas baked under the sun. But inside the stone walls, life took root. Will, the 9-year-old, stopped looking over his shoulder every 10 seconds. He started following Silas around like a shadow. Silas didn't mind. He taught the boy without talking much. They were in the yard one morning. Silas held a thick wooden staff. Will held a smaller one. Balance, Silas said. He tapped Will's left foot with his staff. You're leaning forward. You lean, you fall. Keep your weight centered. Will adjusted his stance. Are you teaching me how to kill a man? The boy asked. His voice was flat, too serious for his age. Silas stopped. He rested his staff in the dirt. I'm teaching you how to stand your ground. Killing is easy, Will. Any coward can pull a trigger in the dark. But standing firm when the world tries to push you down, that takes a man. You fight to protect. You never fight to destroy. Will nodded. He gripped his staff. He didn't lean forward this time. He held his ground, over by the porch. Abby was sitting with Hattie. They were shucking corn. The rhythm of the work was soothing. Hattie paused. She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. She looked at Abby, who was carefully tearing the silk from a yellow ear of corn. "You read good, don't you, Abby?" Hattie asked. "Sister Agnes taught me at the orphanage," Abby said. "Books, ledgers, whatever she could find." Hattie nodded slowly. She picked up another ear of corn. "I was born on a cotton plantation in Georgia, 30 years a slave. Didn't know my letters. Didn't know numbers. Master said reading gave a slave a dangerous mind." Abby stopped shucking. She looked at the older woman. Hattie snapped the stalk off the corn. "When the war ended, I walked away. But walking away didn't make me free. Every time a white man handed me a contract for work, I had to trust his word because I couldn't read the paper." Hattie leaned forward, her dark eyes bored into Abby. "Listen to me, child," Hattie said, her voice dropping into a solemn cadence. "They can put chains on your wrists. They can work you till your bones break. But they have no right to chain your mind. Knowledge is the one weapon they can never steal from you. You keep reading. You teach those babies to read. A mind that knows the truth can't ever be enslaved again." Abby swallowed hard. "I will, Hattie, I promise." "Good," Hattie said. She went back to shucking. "Now hand me that bucket. The peace didn't last. It never does in Texas." It was mid-afternoon when the dog started barking. Silas' old hound, a scarred mutt named Ranger, stood at the edge of the property line. His hackles were up. He was barking down the canyon trail. Silas dropped his tools. He walked to the porch, his hand naturally resting on the heavy Colt revolver at his hip. Abby stepped out the front door, wiping her hands on her apron. A lone rider was coming up the trail. He wasn't riding fast. He kept his hands in plain sight, resting on the saddle horn. He wore a tin-star pinned to a dusty brown vest, Deputy Arthur Hayes. He pulled his horse up to the gate. He was a young man, barely 28. He looked exhausted. He didn't reach for his gun. He just took off his hat and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Silas," Deputy Hayes said. "Arthur," Silas replied. His voice was guarded. He didn't invite the man in. Hayes looked past Silas. He saw Abby standing on the porch. He saw Charlie peeking out from the barn. He let out a long breath. "I came alone," Hayes said, "and I came unofficially. I figured you'd shoot me if I brought a posse." "You figured right," Silas said. "State your business." Hayes shifted in his saddle. "It's Thorne, the Reverend. He knows they here, Silas. The orphans." Abby felt her heart skip a beat. She stepped off the porch and walked up next to Silas. "Why does he care? The orphanage is closed." He got what he wanted. "He didn't just want the orphanage closed," Miss Hayes said, his eyes full of pity. "He wants the land, and he wants this land too. Vance Hollow." Silas' jaw tightened. "My deed is clear. It's been clear since 1865. Thorne has the judge in his pocket," Hayes warned. "He's drawing up papers. Foreclosures, eminent domain for public works. There's a railroad coming. Silas, a straight shot from San Antonio up north. It's supposed to run right through the orphanage property and cut straight through this valley. Thorne is buying it all up for pennies and selling it to the rail company for a fortune." The pieces fell into place. It wasn't about religion. It wasn't about God. It was about gold. Blood and gold. "He sent men to look for the kids," Hayes continued. "He's claiming they wards of the county and that you kidnapped them. He's building a legal case to send the marshals up here to take the kids and to take the land." Silas didn't speak, but Abby saw it. For the first time since she met the giant of the mountain, she saw fear. It wasn't a coward's fear. Silas wasn't afraid of bullets. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was looking at Charlie, holding the stable door. He was looking at Will, gripping his wooden staff. He was looking at Sadie, hiding behind Hattie's skirt. He was afraid of losing his family. Again, the fire took them the first time. Now the law was coming to take them the second time. Hayes put his hat back on. "I got no authority to stop him, Silas. The judge signs the paper. It's legal. I just wanted to warn you. You got maybe 3 days before he sends armed men." Hayes turned his horse. "Good luck, Silas." The deputy rode back down the canyon. The dust settled. The silence returned, but it was a heavy, suffocating silence. Silas stood at the gate. His massive hands gripped the top rail of the wooden fence so hard the timber groaned. His knuckles were white. His shoulders were locked. The trauma of the past was rising up, choking him. He was a man alone against the whole town. Abby walked up to him. She didn't say, "It's going to be okay." She didn't say, "We'll figure it out. Empty words are for empty people." She just stood next to him. She reached out her small, calloused hand. She placed it over his massive, trembling knuckles on the fence rail. She didn't pull him away, she just added her grip to his. Silas looked down at her hand, then he looked at her face. Abby's eyes were fierce, unbreakable. "They aren't taking these kids," Abby said. Her voice was quiet, but it was made of iron. "And they aren't taking your home. You built this place with your own 2 hands. We will fight for it, together." Silas looked at her. He felt the steady warmth of her hand. The panic in his chest began to recede. The fear turned into something else, something dangerous. "Together," Silas echoed. The giant wasn't alone anymore, and Reverend Thorne was about to learn that a mountain doesn't move just because a man tells it to. The night did not bring peace. It brought darkness, heavy and thick, pressing against the limestone walls of the mansion. Inside her small bedroom, Abby lay awake. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. 3 days. That is what Deputy Hayes had given them. 3 days before the world came to tear this sanctuary apart. A faint sound broke the rhythm of the clock, a light tap on her door. It was so soft she thought it might be a moth bumping against the wood. Abby sat up, pulling her shawl over her shoulders. "Come in," she whispered. The latch clicked, the door creaked open, and a small silhouette stepped into the room. It was Will. The 9-year-old was dressed in his oversized nightshirt, his bare feet gray with dust. He was shaking. Not from the night air, the August heat was still trapped in the timber, but from a tremor that came deep from within his bones. Abby slipped off the bed and knelt in front of him. "Will, what's wrong? Are you sick, honey?" Will didn't answer right away. He looked down at his feet. His jaw locked tight, he swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the quiet room. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wide, wet, and terrified. "I have to tell you," Will whispered. His voice was a dry rasp. "Before they come. I have to say it, Abby." "Sit down, Will." Abby guided him to the edge of the mattress. She sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his trembling shoulders. "Take your time. Just look at me and speak." Will rubbed his eyes with the back of his dirty hand. He took a long, shaky breath. "The night the orphanage burned," the boy began. His voice was barely louder than a cricket's chirp. "I wasn't asleep. My stomach was aching. I went to the kitchen to fetch a cup of water from the bucket." Abby felt her chest tighten. She didn't press. She just kept her arms steady around him. "I looked out the window," Will said, his words coming in short, breathless bursts. "The moon was bright. Real bright. I saw 2 men by the back tool shed. They had a tin can, a big one. One man poured liquid on the wood. The other man struck a match." Willa's voice broke. A single tear cut a clean path through the dust on his cheek. "I saw his face," the boy whispered, gripping the edge of the mattress until his knuckles turned white. "When the fire flared up, it lit him right up. It was Hank Doyle, the man who drives the carriage for Reverend Thorne, the church handyman." The silence that followed was suffocating. Abby's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected Thorne's involvement, but hearing it from a witness, from a child who had carried this terrifying weight alone for weeks, made the horror visceral. "Why didn't you tell Sister Agnes before she passed?" Abby asked gently, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you tell the sheriff?" Will looked at her, his eyes hollow. "Hank saw me through the glass. He pointed his finger at me like a gun. He smiled. I knew if I told an adult. Nobody would believe a Mulder's boy over the Reverend's right hand. I thought he'd come back and finish us off if I opened my mouth." Abby pulled the boy close, burying his face in her shoulder. She held him tight, letting him cry out the poison he had kept bottled up inside his small chest. "Listen to me, William," Abby said, pulling back slightly so she could look him dead in the eye. Her voice was firm, steady. "Fear doesn't make you a coward. Will, do you hear me? A coward is a man who sees evil being done, folds his arms, and pretends to be blind just to keep himself safe. You were a boy trying to keep your brother and sister alive. But speaking up tonight, bringing the truth out of the dark, that is the bravest thing you could ever do." Will wiped his nose on his sleeve. He looked at her, the trembling in his limbs finally slowing down. He nodded once, taking in her words like medicine. The lesson was clear, stated plain and simple into the midnight quiet. Truth isn't about being unafraid. It's about speaking when your voice is shaking the next morning. Abby didn't keep the secret. She told Silas and Hattie while the kids were out feeding the chickens. They stood around the oak kitchen table. Silas listened, his face turning into a mask of stone. He didn't curse. He didn't smash a fist into the wall. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out his pocket knife, and began carving a small piece of cedar wood, smooth, deliberate strokes, shaving away the excess, finding the hard core underneath. "Hank Doyle," Silas muttered. his voice dropping into a register so low it vibrated the tin cups on the shelf. "Thorne's dog. He burned that house to clear the deed," Hattie said, slamming a heavy iron skillet onto the stove. "He knew those babies were inside. He didn't care." Silas didn't look up from his carving. He wanted the land for the tracks. The railroad company pays top dollar for a clear line through the valley. A coney via an orphanage with a legal title complicates things. Fire cleans the slate. He blew a stray wood shaving off his thumb. The action was calm but implied a terrible focused intent. He was no longer just a man protecting his homestead. He was a man who understood the architecture of the enemy's greed. Silas stood up. Pocketing his knife, he looked at Abby. "I'm going to the gate. I need to reinforce the eastern fence line. Will, fetch your staff. Come with me." The 9-year-old ran out of the barn, his wooden staff gripped tight in his hand. He didn't look like a scared boy anymore. He walked right beside the giant, matching his long strides as best as his short legs could manage. Abby watched them go from the porch. Silas didn't give Will a lecture on bravery. He didn't tell him to forget what he saw. Instead, as they reached the perimeter fence, Silas handed Will a heavy iron spade. "Dig here," Silas said, pointing to the base of a sagging fence post, deep, 2 feet down into the dirt. Will didn't complain. He shoved the spade into the hard, red earth. He threw his weight against the iron, lifting the heavy soil, clearing out the old rotten wood to make way for a fresh cedar post. Silas stood by, watching the boy sweat. He didn't offer to take the spade. He let the boy do the heavy lifting. Real healing doesn't come from being coddled. It comes from labor, from doing the hard work of clearing out the rot so you can build something solid in its place. By noon, the eastern gate was fortified. It was stronger than it had ever been. But as Abby looked out toward the mouth of the canyon, she knew that timber and iron wouldn't be enough to hold back the storm that was coming. The attack didn't come under the glare of the noon sun. It came at 3 in the morning, when the moon had slipped behind the limestone peaks and left the world in a shroud of black. Ranger, the old hound, didn't bark. He let out a low, guttural growl from beneath the front porch, a sound that traveled through the floorboards and woke Silas instantly. Silas was out of bed before his eyes were fully open. He didn't light a lamp. He didn't make a sound. He slipped his Winchester rifle from the rack, chambered around with a smooth, silent slide of the lever, and glided out onto the dark porch. Abby met him at the doorway, her breath coming quick. She held the small Colt revolver Silas had given her. Her hands were cold, but they weren't shaking. "Stay inside," Silas whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Keep the kids in the back storeroom with Hattie. Don't open the door for anyone but me." "Silas, go, Abby." She didn't argue. She knew her place in the defensive line. She retreated to the dark hallway, pulling Will, Charlie, and a wide-eyed Sadie into the deep, windowless storeroom where Hattie waited with a heavy iron poker outside. The silence of the canyon was shattered by the sharp crack of a dry branch. 3 figures moved through the shadows near the eastern fence line. They wore dark coats, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats. One of them carried a tin lantern. Another held a heavy iron crowbar. They weren't marshals. They weren't deputies. They were hired men, smelling of cheap whiskey and bad intentions. They reached the gate Silas and Will had reinforced that morning. One of the men raised the crowbar, ready to smash the iron latch. "You're standing on private land," a voice boomed from the darkness of the porch. The 3 men froze. The one with the lantern swung the light upward, the yellow beam cutting through the dark until it hit the porch steps. Silas stood there. He looked like an extension of the limestone house itself, massive, unforgiving. The Winchester was nestled perfectly against his shoulder. The dark barrel pointed directly at the chest of the man with the crowbar. "Turn around," Silas said. His voice wasn't angry. It was flat, cold, like winter water. "The road back to redemption is long. I suggest you start walking." The man in the center, a rough-looking character with a jagged scar across his lip, let out a harsh, dry laugh. "We got a paper from the judge, Vance. This land is under foreclosure. You're a trespasser." "The judge doesn't own this valley," Silas said. He didn't shift his stance an inch. "I cut the stone for these walls. I drove the cedar into the dirt. You take 1 step past that gate, and you won't be walking back." A tense, suffocating stalemate settled over the yard. The wind whistled through the mesquite trees, a lonely, whistling sound. The man with the crowbar looked at Silas. He looked at the size of the man's shoulders. He looked at the steady, unblinking glare of the rifle barrel. He lowered the crowbar. "This ain't over, freak," the leader spat, backing away into the shadows. "Thorne's got the law on his side. You can't fight the whole county. Let him try," Silas said. The 3 figures melted back into the darkness. the sound of their horses' hooves fading down the canyon trail toward the town. When the sun finally rose, casting a pale, yellow light over the valley, the aftermath of the night became clear. The gate was intact, but curved into the wood of the outer post was a fresh, deep mark, a legal notice, stamped with the seal of the county court, demanding the eviction of Elijah Cade and any unauthorized occupants within 48 hours. Inside the kitchen, the air was tight with a different kind of tension. Abby stood by the stove, her jaw set. "We have to go to town, Silas. We have to face them in the courtroom. If we stay here and shoot it out with the marshals, Thorne wins anyway. He'll just call you a murderer and take the land over your grave." Silas stood by the window, his back to her. His massive shoulders were hunched, the burn scar on his neck angry and red in the morning light. "The court is not corrupt, Abby," Silas said, his voice tight. "The judge is Thorne's cousin. Going to that town is stepping right into a slaughterhouse. Out here, I have the stone, I have the rifle, I can protect you." Abby dropped her dish rag. She walked right up behind him, her boots clicking sharp on the floorboards. "You can't protect us from a whole regiment of Texas Rangers, Silas," she said, her voice rising. "You're trying to fight a war with a single gun because you're afraid of what happens if you trust the world again." Silas turned around, his face dark with an old buried fury. "I trusted the world 5 years ago, Abby, and it burned my mama and daddy to ash while I was standing 50 yards away in the barn. I won't let it happen again." They stood chest to chest, the giant and the 18-year-old girl. The argument wasn't about the land. It wasn't about Thorne. It was about the architecture of their survival. Silas wanted to build a wall. Abby wanted to build a bridge. Respect in a relationship doesn't mean always agreeing. It means having the safety to scream your fears into the open without the other person walking away. Hattie stepped into the kitchen, holding Sadie by the hand. She looked at the two of them, her eyes wise and heavy. "You two are yelling about stone and paper," Hattie said, her voice cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. "But what you're really doing is being terrified of losing what we just found. Look at each other. Stop fighting the ghosts and look at what's standing right in front of you." Silas blinked. He looked down at Abby. Her eyes were bright, wet with tears she refused to let fall. She wasn't backing down, not because she was stubborn, but because she loved this place. Because she loved him too much to watch him die on his own porch. Silas let out a long, ragged breath. The anger drained out of him, leaving him looking exhausted. "I don't know how to fight them with paper, Abby," he whispered. "I do," she said, reaching out and taking his massive hand. "You cut the stone, Silas. Let me handle the words that afternoon." Sadie sat on the porch rug. She had her charcoal stick out. She was drawing again, her little fingers moving with a frantic, desperate speed. Silas walked out and stood over her, his shadow covering her paper. Sadie finished her stroke and looked up. She didn't shrink away. She pointed her small, charcoal-stained finger at the corner of the drawing. Silas knelt down. The drawing was a house, a big house, surrounded by flames. Standing in front of the fire was a man in a long black coat. In his right hand he held a lantern. In his left he held a heavy gold ring. On the ring, Sadie had carefully drawn a tiny perfect symbol, a circle surrounded by sharp, jagged thorns. Silas reached out, his hand trembling as he took the edge of the paper. He recognized the symbol. It wasn't a child's fancy. It was the personal seal of Reverend Ezekiel Thorne, the same mark stamped on the eviction notice pinned to his front gate. He looked at Sadie. The 5-year-old girl looked back at him, her eyes old, quiet, and completely steady. The truth wasn't just coming from the town. It was already here, drawn in black charcoal on a scrap of paper, waiting for the sun to find it. The charcoal did not lie. Children do not invent malice. They only record what the world forces them to see. Silas sat at his heavy oak desk for 3 hours after Sadie gave him the drawing. The house was quiet. The children were asleep. But the air in the room felt thick, smelling of old ash and old anger. Silas reached down to his boots. He took a small brass key from the lining of his left stirrup leather. He unlocked a hidden drawer beneath the desktop. From the dark cavity, he pulled out a small piece of cloth. It was stained with soot. Inside the cloth lay a melted lump of silver. It was a signet ring, or what was left of one. He had found it 5 years ago, sifting through the white-hot coals of his parents' bedroom while his skin was still blistered and peeling. The face of the ring was warped by the heat, but if you turned it into the lamplight just right, you could still see the shape. A circle, 12 sharp, symmetrical thorns pointing outward like teeth. It was the exact same mark Sadie had drawn on the paper. The exact same mark stamped in red wax at the bottom of the eviction notice on the gate. Silas did not roar. He didn't break the chair. He just stood up, his massive frame blocking the light from the oil lamp. He strapped his Colt revolver to his hip. He picked up his Winchester. Abby was waiting for him by the front door. She had her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She looked at the guns. She looked at the cold, dead look in his green eyes. "Where are you going, Silas?" she asked. Her voice was just a whisper in the dark hallway. "Redemption," Silas said. "To finish it, with a gun." Abby stepped into his path. She didn't touch him. She just stood there, a small wall of bone and spirit. "You kill him in his church, Silas, and the law will hunt you down like a mad dog. They'll take Vance Hollow. They put these kids in cages. Is that what your mother would have wanted?" Silas paused. The name of his mother hit him like an iron fist to the jaw. He looked down at Abby. "He burned my family, Abby," Silas said. His voice was a low, jagged rasp. "He killed a 10-year-old girl because my daddy wouldn't sign over the valley. He has been stealing this county acre by acre for 10 years. Who's going to stop him if I don't?" "The law will," Abby said. "The law belongs to him." "Then we take it back," Abby said, her blue eyes flashing like flint in the shadows. She reached out and placed her small hand directly over the cylinder of his rifle. "Listen to me, Silas Vance. If you pull that trigger tonight, you let his hatred dictate who you are. You let him turn you into a murderer just to settle a score." She leaned closer, her voice ringing clear with an explicit value. "Hatred is a trap, Silas. It makes you think you're getting even. But all it really does is turn the victim into the next monster. If you handle Thorn the way he handles the world, then Thorn wins anyway. He destroys your soul after he's already destroyed your house. Real justice isn't about blood, it's about truth. We take him to that court, and we force them to look at what he did in the daylight." Silas stared at her. His chest heaved beneath his shirt. The burn scar on his neck felt hot, itching with the memory of the flames. He looked at her hand on the gun. He looked at the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. Slowly the tension left his shoulders. He lowered the barrel of the Winchester. "He's got a trial set for tomorrow morning," Silas said, his voice dropping into a flat, tired cadence. "An emergency session, to clear the title." "Then we'll be there," Abby said. From the shadows of the kitchen, Hattie stepped out. She had an old wool coat over her arm. Her dark face was lined with a deep, sorrowful wisdom. "I'll go with you," Hattie said. "I saw him that night, Silas, 5 years ago. I saw a man in a long black coat riding away from the flames before the alarm was ever raised. I knew the shape of his horse. I knew the shape of his hat." Silas turned to her. "Why didn't you tell the sheriff back then, Hattie?" Hattie let out a short, bitter laugh. She looked at her own dark hands. She didn't need to explain the politics of 1873 Texas. A freed black woman calling the town's most holy minister an arsonist and a murderer would have ended with her swinging from an oak tree before sunset. The system wasn't built to hear her voice, but standing here now, next to Silas and Abby, she was ready to speak anyway. The risk hadn't changed, but her willingness to bear it had. "The world is different now," Hattie said, pulling her coat on. "We got the drawings, we got the melted silver, and we got each other. That's enough to make a stand." They spent the rest of the night preparing. Silas didn't clean his guns. He sat at the table with Will, showing the boy how to arrange the deeds and the receipts from the lumber yard into a neat leather portfolio. He taught the 9-year-old how to check the dates, how to verify the county clerk's stamps. Will worked with a quiet, intense focus. He wasn't shaking anymore. Silas was handing the boy a different kind of weapon, not a staff or a stone, but the power of organization, the power of facts, by involving the boy in the defense of their home. Silas was showing him that order and preparation are the true counters to chaos and terror. When the first yellow light of dawn broke over the limestone peaks, Vance's Hollow was ready. They packed into Silas' heavy wooden farm wagon. Silas held the reins. Abby sat beside him, holding Sadie in her lap. Will and Charlie sat in the back with Hattie, their small faces clean and serious. They drove out through the narrow rock fissure, away from the sanctuary, down into the valley, toward the town of Redemption. The town of Redemption was buzzing like a disturbed hornet's nest. The courtroom was located on the second floor of the wooden town hall, right above the livery stable. The air inside was hot, smelling of dried sweat, horse manure, and cheap tobacco. Every bench was packed with townspeople, chattering, looking over their shoulders. When the door opened and Silas Vance walked in, the room went dead silent. Folks hadn't seen the mountain in 5 years. They stared at his size. They stared at the jagged, red burned scar climbing up his jawline, but mostly they stared at the people walking behind him. a tiny girl with a fierce gaze, a black housekeeper with her head held high, and 3 clean, quiet orphans. Reverend Ezekiel Thorne sat at the front table. He looked immaculate. His black wool suit was brushed clean of dust. His silver hair was combed perfectly. A massive gold ring with a thorn crest glittered on his right hand as he rested it casually on a stack of legal documents. He didn't look like a man who was afraid. He looked like a king about to claim his crown. Judge Thaddeus Thorne, Ezekiel's first cousin, sat behind the high wooden bench. He rapped his wooden gavel twice. This court is now in session. The judge barked, his voice nasal and impatient. The matter before us is the foreclosure and title clearance of the property known as Vance S. Hollow. Under the petition of the Redemption Methodist Trustee Board, Ezekiel Thorne stood up. He smiled at the spectators. His voice was warm honey. "Your Honor," Ezekiel said, turning his pale eyes toward Silas, "we bring this petition with a heavy heart. The man standing before you, Silas Vance, has occupied that Thung Lung, that valley, without a valid county title since the unfortunate fire of 1873. Furthermore, he has unlawfully harbored 3 wards of the state, taken from a closed county facility. We ask that the land be remanded to the town for public utility, and the children be returned to the proper authorities." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Abby felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She looked at the judge, who was already nodding, ready to sign the paper on his desk. The game was rigged. It had been rigged before they ever left the mountain. Abby stood up. Her boots clicked sharp against the pine floorboards. "Your Honor," Abby called out. Her voice was small, but it didn't shake. "Before you sign that order, you need to look at the original K-Wook, the original land deed of 1865. Judge Thorne scowled. "Who are you, girl? You got no standing in this court." "My name is Abigail Weston," she said, stepping into the center aisle. She held a faded, yellowed piece of parchment in her hand. "And I have every right to speak. This land wasn't just bought by the Vance family. In 1865, grandfather, Margaret Holt Weston, funded half the purchase. Because women couldn't hold title alone back then, the name Weston was omitted from the primary line. But it says right here in Clause 7. She marched right up to the bench and slammed the paper down in front of the judge. Ezekiel Thorne's smile vanished for a fraction of a second. His eyes narrowed into slits as he looked at the document. Abby turned to the courtroom, her voice rising so every man on the back bench could hear her explicit value. "The law isn't a weapon for the rich to steal from the poor, Your Honor. The law is a shield meant to protect the rights of every citizen, no matter how small they are. Clause 7 clearly states that if the Vance line is ever challenged, or if the property faces dispute, the Weston heirs have immediate co-ownership and veto power over any sale or transfer. This valley belongs to Silas Vance, and it belongs to me. You cannot foreclose on land when the legal owners are standing right in front of you, refusing to sell." The judge stared at the paper. His fingers twitched. This is an old document. It hasn't been verified by the county clerk. It was verified this morning." Deputy Hayes's voice cut through the room. The young deputy stepped out from the back of the courtroom. He didn't look at the reverend. He walked straight to the judge's bench and laid down a ledger book. "I went to the county seat at dawn." "Your Honor," Hayes said, "the stamps are real. The title is solid. Reverend Thorne's petition is based on a fraudulent claim." The crowd erupted into shouting. Judge Thorne rapped his gavel furiously. "Silence, silence in the court." Ezekiel Thorne stood up, his face dark with a cold, venomous rage. "This is a circus. The word of an orphan girl and a disgruntled deputy cannot overturn the spiritual and economic progress of this town. The railroad is coming. Thaddeus, the land must be cleared." "There's more, Your Honor," Abby said. She turned and pointed a finger directly at Ezekiel's right hand. "The land was cleared 5 years ago by fire, and the orphanage was cleared last month by fire. The same fire, the same man, insolent girl." Ezekiel roared. "William," Abby called out. Will Turner stood up from the front bench. He walked to the center of the room. He looked small against the high ceilings, but his face was set like iron. He looked right at Ezekiel Thorne. "I saw him," Will said. His voice was a clear, steady bell. "I saw his man Hank Doyle light the match at the orphanage. And I saw the Reverend standing by the carriage, watching it burn. He pointed his finger at me. He told me to stay quiet. The boy is lying." Ezekiel shouted, his honey voice completely gone, replaced by a harsh, grating screech. Hattie stood up next. Her voice was a deep, gravelly weight that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "He ain't lying. I saw you 5 years ago, Ezekiel Thorne. I saw you ride away from the Vance house while the children were screaming inside. You dropped your silver ring in the dirt. Silas found it. We got it right here." Silas stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He placed the melted lump of silver, the thorn signet, directly next to the eviction notice on the judge's table. The 12 sharp thorns matched the ink stamp perfectly then. Little Sadie walked up. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at the crowd. She took her stick of charcoal and drew a large black circle on the white wood of the defense table. She drew 12 sharp thorns pointing outward. Then she pointed her small dirty finger straight at Ezekiel Thorne's face. The courtroom went deathly quiet. In the silence, the drawing of a 5-year-old child who could not speak became the loudest voice in the room. The truth didn't need a golden tongue or a fancy suit. It didn't need a title or a bribe. It just needed to be shown. The sheer weight of their collective evidence, the deed, the witness, the ring. The drawing shattered the illusion of Thorne's holiness. Ezekiel Thorne looked around the room. He saw the faces of the townspeople changing. The respect was gone. The fear was turning into disgust. He looked at Deputy Hayes, whose hand was already resting on his handcuffs. The Reverend slowly sat back down in his chair. His shoulders sagged. The gold ring on his hand looked heavy, dull. Judge Thorne looked at his cousin. Then he looked at the original 1865 deed. He knew when a ship was sinking. He rapped his gavel one last time, his voice hollow. "This court finds the foreclosure petition invalid," the judge muttered. "The title remains with Silas Vance and Abigail Weston. Furthermore, Deputy Hayes, take Henry Doyle and Ezekiel Thorne into custody pending a grand jury investigation for arson and murder." Hayes stepped forward. The iron cuffs clicked loud in the quiet room. As they led Ezekiel Thorne away, the disgraced minister stopped in front of Silas. He looked up at the giant, his eyes filled with a desperate, dying malice. "You think you won something, Vance?" Thorne hissed. "The railroad is still coming. The world will still pave you over." Silas looked down at him. The burn scar on his neck didn't itch anymore. It was just skin, just wood that had survived the fire. "Let it come," Silas said, his voice deep and calm as the mountain itself. "The walls are thick enough." Abby stepped up beside him. She took his massive hand in hers. Their calluses scratched against each other, a hard, honest texture. They walked out of the courtroom together, the 3 children following close in their footsteps, leaving the dark room behind as they stepped out into the bright, clean Texas sun. The autumn in Texas does not rush. It takes its time. It waits until the brutal August heat finally cracks. Then it rolls down through the limestone hills with a cool, sharp breeze that smells of dried grass and clean sky. By October, the town of Redemption was a different place. Reverend Ezekiel Thorne was sitting in a stone cell down in Austin, awaiting the gallows, his cousin. The judge had packed his bags and left the county under the cover of a moonless night. The grand jury hadn't taken long. Once the ledger books were opened, the whole rotten structure collapsed, turns out. Greed leaves a paper trail a mile wide if you know how to look. Up in Vance Hollow, the walls stood firm. The railroad was still coming. You couldn't stop the steel rails any more than you could stop the sunrise. But the engineers had to adjust their survey maps. They had to bypass the valley entirely, laying the tracks 3 miles to the south on public land. They paid Silas and Abby a fair price just for the right-of-way near the timber line. Peace, when it finally arrived, was an unusual thing. It took some getting used to. It was a Tuesday morning when the buggy pulled up to the gate. Silas stood on the porch, his hand resting easy on his belt. Abby came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. A man climbed down from the buggy. He wasn't wearing a black suit. He wore a simple flannel shirt, his boots worn but clean. His face was lined with old regrets, but his eyes were clear, sober. It was Charlie's father, Thomas Miller Sr. Deputy Hayes had found him 2 towns over. The man had spent 2 years working a sawmill, keeping his distance because he thought his boy had been taken by a good family after the mother died. He hadn't known about the orphanage. He hadn't known about the fire. Charlie stood near the stable door. He didn't run to the man. He didn't hide. He just gripped a wooden bucket, his small jaw set tight. The man walked up to the fence line. He didn't cross it. He stopped and looked at his boy. "Charlie," the man said. His voice was rough, like gravel turning in a stream. "You grown some." Charlie didn't answer. He looked at Silas. Silas gave the boy a single slow nod. The man knelt down in the dirt, his hands resting on his knees. "I ain't here to force you into a wagon, son. I made a mess of things after your mama passed. The drink took me under. But I've been dry 2 years now. Got a cabin by the mill. Got a garden I want to try if you'll let me." Charlie looked down at the broken dirt. He looked at the mended bucket in his hand. The anger that usually flared up in him didn't come. The time in the hollow had given him a foundation. He wasn't a cornered animal anymore. He walked to the fence. He didn't jump into the man's arms. He just stood across the timber from him and offered the bucket. "The well needs fetching," Charlie said. "You can help if you want." The old man let out a shaky breath. He smiled. "I'd like that, son." Abby watched them walk toward the spring together. She felt a tear touch her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. Silas stepped down off the porch. He stood beside her, his massive frame a solid shield against the wind. "He's gonna be all right," Silas said. "I know," Abby whispered. The children were finding their paths. Will was already spending 3 afternoons a week in town with old Dr. Boone. The boy had a mind like a steel trap. He didn't just want to read the medical books, he wanted to understand how the bones fit together, how the blood kept the heart moving. He was learning the architecture of the human body. And then there was Sadie. The little 5-year-old was sitting at the kitchen table. She didn't have her charcoal stick today. She was helping Hattie snap green beans into a clay bowl. Snap, snap. The sound was rhythmic, comfortable. Hattie reached over and patted the girl's hair. "You're doing fine, sugar. Just pull the string off the side first." Sadie stopped. She looked at the green bean. She looked up at Hattie's kind, dark face. She opened her mouth. Her throat clicked. It was a small, dry sound at first, like a rusty hinge turning after years in the rain. "Grandma," Sadie said. The word was clear. It was small, but it filled the entire kitchen. Hattie froze. The green bean dropped from her fingers. She stared at the little girl. Sadie didn't cry. She just smiled, her green eyes bright and peaceful. The Sang-Chun, the trauma, had finally loosened its grip. The safety of the stone walls had done what no doctor could do. It had given her back her voice. Hattie didn't say a word. She just reached out her large, soft arms, pulled Sadie into her lap, and buried her face in the girl's shoulder. For the first time since Abby had met her, the strong, unbreakable Hattie Jenkins wept. Quiet, happy tears that washed away the dust of old sorrows. By evening the hollow turned blue. The shadows of the limestone cliff stretched long across the yard. Silas was sitting on the back porch steps. He had a piece of cedar in his hand, but he wasn't carving it. He was just holding the wood, feeling the grain. Abby walked out and sat on the step above him. Her skirt rustled against his leather coat. "The boys are asleep," Abby said. Sadie still talking Hattie's ear off in the kitchen. Silas let out a low chuckle. "Never thought I'd see the day this place was noisy. Do you mind it?" Silas turned his head. The burn scar looked smooth now, softened by the shadows. "No. It sounds like a house, not just a pile of rock." He set the cedar down. He looked out at the valley. Then he looked up at her. His green eyes were serious. "Clear, I need to ask you something, Abby," Silas said. His voice dropped into that deep, slow register. Abby waited. She didn't push. "The court gave you half the deed," Silas said. "The Weston name is on the ledger now. You got money coming from the railroad. You could go to San Antonio. You could buy a fine house with glass windows. You don't have to stay up here in the dirt with a scarred man and an old housekeeper." Abby looked at him. She looked at his massive shoulders. She looked at the hands that had faded through 5 years of isolation just to build a monument to the people he loved. "Are you asking me to leave?" "Silas Vance," she asked. "No," Silas said quickly. His hand twitched on his knee. I'm asking what you want." Abby leaned forward. She rested her elbows on her knees, her face close to his. She spoke plain, delivering the truth with an explicit value. "Family isn't something that's decided by blood, Silas. It isn't a name written in a family Bible or a title on a county courthouse ledger. Family is the people who look at your scars and don't turn away. It's also the folks who choose to stand in the doorway when the wind is howling and the world is trying to tear the roof off. You carried my children up this mountain when we were starving. You gave us a trade when the town gave us charity. I don't want a house in San Antonio. I want to be where the walls are built by an honest man." Silas didn't move for a long time. He just absorbed her words. He felt the truth of them settle into his bones, filling up the hollow spaces the fire had left behind. He reached out. His massive calloused hand covered hers where it rested on the stone step. He didn't pull away. "The eastern gate needs a new hinge tomorrow," Silas said. His voice was husky. "The iron is rusting." Abby smiled. She squeezed his fingers. "I'll help you hold the timber." "That's a deal," he said. The next morning, the sun rose white and brilliant over the Texas hill country. Abby woke before the dawn, just like she always did. It was an old habit. But when she walked into the kitchen, she stopped. The stove was already hot. The iron kettle was whistling, sending a sweet plume of steam into the rafters. The flour bin was full to the brim. Silas was standing by the counter. He had his sleeves rolled up, his massive hairy forearms dusted with white flour. He had a piece of grease-stained paper in his left hand, holding it close to his eyes under the yellow light of the oil lamp. Hattie's recipe for cornbread. He was frowning at the paper, his jaw working, as he tried to figure out the measurements. Ranger, the old hound, sat by his boot, looking up with a look of supreme hope. Silas heard her step. He turned around, looking embarrassed. He held up a small tin spoon. Hattie wrote down a pinch of salt, Silas said, his deep voice sounding thoroughly confused. How much is a pinch when your thumb is the size of a walnut? Abby looked at him, the giant of the mountain, the savage of the hills, standing there in a flour-stained apron, trying to bake bread for the people under his roof. A laugh bubbled up from her chest. A real laugh, clear, bright, and completely free of weight. It echoed through the kitchen, bouncing off the limestone walls. It was the first time that sound had ever been heard in Vance Hollow. Charlie came trotting into the kitchen, his hair messy from sleep. He sat down at the table and grinned. "Mr. Silas is going to burn the bread, Abby." "No, he ain't," Silas said, not looking back. "I'm learning." Abby walked across the floor. She stood right beside him at the counter, her shoulder resting against his massive ribs. She took the tin spoon from his hand. "Let me show you, Silas," she said softly. "You just take a little bit. Right here between the fingers." He watched her. He learned. The work wasn't hard when you had someone to divide the weight. The kitchen filled with the smell of sweet corn and hot coffee. Outside, the morning breeze stirred the mesquite trees, but the smoke rising from the stone chimney went straight up into the clear blue sky, a steady, unbroken line. Abby Weston looked out the window at the hills. For the first time in her 18 years, she didn't have to worry about tomorrow. She was home. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
And so, as the morning light rises over the limestone hills of Texas and the smoke from Vance's Hollow climbs straight into the clean blue sky, we come to the end of a story that began with hunger, fear, and a desperate walk toward a mountain everyone else was afraid to face. Abigail Weston did not begin this journey as a hero in her own eyes. She was only an 18-year-old girl trying to keep 3 starving children alive when the world had already decided they were too poor, too small, and too inconvenient to matter. Yet that is where true courage often begins, not in grand speeches, not in polished halls, and not in the hands of powerful men, but in the quiet decision to keep walking when there is no food left, no shelter promised, and no one coming to save you. This story teaches us first that poverty is not a moral failure. It is not a punishment from God. It is not proof that a person lacks worth. Reverend Ezekiel Thorne tried to dress cruelty in holy language. He called suffering purification, and he used the name of faith to hide his greed. But Abby saw the truth clearly. Children do not become stronger by starving. They do not become holier by being abandoned. A society that allows the weak to suffer, while the powerful profit from their misery, has not passed a test of faith. It has failed one. Through Abby's love for Charlie, Will, and Sadie, we are reminded that the measure of any community is not how beautifully it speaks of mercy, but how it treats the hungry child sitting at the table. Silas Vance, the so-called monster of the mountain, becomes one of the strongest symbols in this tale. The town feared him because they saw only his size, his scars, and his silence. They turned his grief into a legend and his isolation into a warning. But when the children were bleeding and starving on the rocks, Silas did not act like a monster. He lowered his rifle. He lifted Charlie and Sadie into his arms. He turned his back to the wind and led them home. In that single act, the story tells us that character is not measured by reputation. It is measured by what a person does when no one is watching and when helping someone else will cost them peace, safety, and perhaps everything they own. Vance's Hollow is more than a house. It is a monument to survival. Every stone in those walls was carried by a man who had lost his family to fire and still refused to let grief erase him. Silas did not build that home simply to hide from the world. He built it because love has to go somewhere after loss. Sometimes grief becomes bitterness. Sometimes it becomes violence, but in Silas, grief became stone, shelter, garden soil, bookshelves, and a fire warm enough to save others. That is one of the deepest lessons of this story. We cannot always choose what pain enters our lives, but we can choose what we build from it. Hattie brings another powerful truth to the heart of the story. As a woman who had survived slavery, she understands that freedom is more than walking away from a place of bondage. Freedom must reach the mind. It must reach the stomach. It must reach the hands. Her wisdom teaches that a full belly is not a privilege, and that knowledge is not a luxury reserved for the rich. Food, safety, literacy, and dignity are the foundations of human life. When Hattie tells Abby to teach the children to read, she is not merely speaking about letters on a page. She is speaking about power. A person who can read cannot be so easily cheated. A child who learns the truth cannot be so easily enslaved by fear. The children each carry a wound, and each wound reveals a different kind of healing. Charlie's anger is not wickedness. It is pain with nowhere to go. Silas does not beat that anger out of him. He gives it work. He teaches him to mend the bucket, to use his hands, to turn fire into labor instead of destruction. Will carries the burden of a terrible truth, believing his silence made him a coward. Abby teaches him that fear does not cancel bravery. Speaking with a shaking voice is still courage. And Sadie, silent from trauma, slowly finds her way back to speech because safety gives the soul permission to breathe again. When she finally calls Hattie, "Grandma," that one small word becomes a victory greater than any gunfight. It proves that love, patience, and protection can restore what violence tried to take away. The struggle against Reverend Thorne also reminds us that evil often hides behind respectable clothing. Thorne has a Bible, a courtroom, a judge, and the language of progress on his side. He speaks of public works and God's will, but beneath those words is land hunger and murder. The story warns us that law and religion become dangerous when they are used as masks for greed. True justice does not belong only to men with